It's the Mackinaw Mill Creek Camping Show.
Hi, my name's Frank Rogala, and in this first episode of the Mackinaw Mill Creek Camping Show, I want to introduce you to the camp and its story, which is also the story of my family. Richard and Rose Rogala were married in Allenton, Michigan in the early 1950s. By 1963, Rose and Dick had 3 sons. My name is Frank, I was 5, Chris was 3, and Vince was about 1. Edward was to follow a few years later. Dad used his carpentry skills to build a small stove, icebox, and sink into a new Chevy Corvair Greenbrier van. At night, everything folded up and somehow there was room for all of us to sleep, which was important because we were setting off on a 10,000-mile trip to search the United States and Canada to not only find the best place for a campground, but to learn everything we could about camping. The nation was in the midst of building interstate highways from coast to coast, and as a veteran of World War II, Richard knew that after American GIs came home from abroad, they wouldn't be content to stay down on the farm. He saw the exciting future of the mobile lifestyle of camping coming, and he and Rose were determined to become a part of it. Richard and Rose had been working for years with a house-moving business that they operated together with Rose's brother Alfred. They'd purchase and move condemned houses out of the path of the new interstate freeways snaking through southeastern Michigan. They would then resituate the houses, in some cases creating whole subdivisions of these recycled homes. Mom and Dad worked hard and socked away everything they could, waiting for the day they could open their very own campground. And so it was when we set off on that summer morning in 1963, Mom, Dad, Chris, Vince, and I in the little Chevy van with 10,000 miles of open road laid out before us. Wherever we could, we stopped and looked up relatives along the way. But I'd seen Uncle Harry and Aunt June before. But the amazing water skiers at Cypress Garden, alligators, the mysterious manatees and dolphins, and we were just in Florida. It was a golden age for the nation's national parks. Dad said, in Europe, they don't even have a Grand Canyon. The geysers and steaming hot pools that smelled like rotten eggs at Yellowstone National Park. Mom wouldn't let us feed the bears like everyone else. She said you're not supposed to do that. Dad told us to stay on the boardwalks, otherwise we might fall through the thin crust of the volcanic surface and boil to death in the bubbling water. In the petrified forest, they had wood that was made out of rock. Rock that was made out of wood, or I don't know, I'm still not clear on that one. I'm pretty sure it's the first time any of us had ever seen a desert, and I know it's the first time I'd ever seen a mountain. We stopped at a real ghost town, and in the graveyard there was graves from real cowboys, and then fake cowboys came out and pretended to shoot each other. Mom said that she was pretty sure that the Hoover Dam was a miracle of the modern world. It sure looked like one to me. A giant cowboy made out of flashing lights waved to us as we drove down the street from the Golden Nugget, and a marquee advertised that the entire Rat Pack was in residence at the Sands. Disneyland had only been open a couple years. I remember getting a haircut and being able to see the Matterhorn out the front of the barber shop. Orange groves still surrounded it. Mom and Dad contemplated building their campground near Disneyland in Anaheim, but then decided it was too far away from our family in Michigan. Walt Disney was on TV every Sunday night. How could so many dreams come true on one trip? We actually got to set foot in Disneyland. Our trip continued up the California coast. We marveled at the giant redwoods and incredible scenery along California's Highway 1. We saw the giant sequoias that had been cut out to allow cars to drive through. Our van was too big to fit, so Dad pulled over, and when no one was looking, we walked through it hand in hand. Of all the wonders of Yosemite, The one that impressed this 5-year-old the most was a nightly bonfire. Once it was blazing, a park ranger raked it over the cliff, making a glowing amber fire waterfall that lit up the night sky and mirrored Yosemite's real waterfalls. Heading up the coast through Oregon and Washington, we saw strange creatures that we watched being pulled from traps and boiled alive before we cracked open their shells and ate them. I remember Chris standing in the gentle surf and crying because the retreating wave moving past his feet had disoriented him. Mom smiled and comforted him, and I think she was happy that the distress wasn't due to yet another skinned elbow or knee. Suddenly, we were in Canada, and Mom was especially impressed with the beauty of British Columbia. I could see her imagining living there. We traveled on, visiting her cousins in Saskatchewan and Alberta. After the hills and mountains, it was a shock to see the endless fields that looked a lot like the Great Plains. I'll never forget how my second cousin showed me how to make a roaring fire out of dried cow chips. Now our trip turned southward to the Dakotas, the Black Hills, and Mount Rushmore. On a trip filled with so many wonders, what could be more natural than seeing 4 presidents' heads carved into the side of a mountain? Dad certainly was adventurous, but you have to give my mom credit for letting him actually take Vince, who was probably only about 13 months old, and I up in a tiny helicopter with no doors. Vince and I didn't even have a seatbelt. The ride, though, was so thrilling that neither one of us even cried. It was time to head home. The long trip had made us all homesick and probably helped Mom and Dad decide to build the campground somewhere near our family in Michigan. Soon after getting home, they tried to purchase land in Charlevoix, but after a contentious zoning hearing where the locals, who feared that a campground would negatively affect their property values and bring in too many of the wrong class of people, turned down a request for a zoning variance. Mom and Dad were surprised at the negative reactions. After all, to them a campground was a wonderful place. Who wouldn't want one next door? A few years later, that same land was leased by promoters who threw raucous rock concerts that continued for nearly 10 years and must have tormented those locals. However crushed Mom and Dad felt, the setback turned out to be a blessing in disguise.